Alright, good evening everyone. My name is Benjamin and welcome back to another video where today I'm going to be talking a little bit about some crosstabs. We've finally gotten some very high quality polls since the conventions. And the first one, this is the Selzer and Company poll. And it was done on behalf of someone, but there were a few things that when I started looking at the crosstabs that I thought were really weird. Now, the top line result, by the way, is often weighted, right? And that's a normal and respected practice when it comes to polling, because you're not always going to get a representative sample of the population. It needs to be well mixed, basically. And the idea is basically if you have a this is the way Gallup, the original guy who founded Gallup, I forget what his first name was, but there's a reason the company's called Gallup. He used this analogy to explain how he did polling, which was if you have a sample that is well mixed and balanced to the population of whatever you're looking for, if you'll get a good poll. Or, to use the analogy he used, if you have a giant jar of, let's say, 1,000 jelly beans, and you reach in there and you pick out 100, well, the overall composition of those 100 jelly beans should be roughly the same as the entire barrel. So, if you do a good enough job, you'll get good results. Now, here's the thing that I was a little interested in, was looking at the racial breakdown, and then when you look at the education, you need to break it down by whites, but because that's really the only group it truly matters for. Now, Selzer's poll has Trump getting about 23% of the non-white vote. Interestingly, 4% goes to to other people. 3% say they wouldn't, and none specified or undecided is 6%. 64% goes to Joe Biden, but I'm a little. That number seems really low when we think about it, because let's say Joe Biden is getting about 88 or 90% of black vote. Think about how much of the Hispanic vote Trump would have to get in order to get that down to 64%, considering Hispanic voters are around maybe 5% more of the electorate than African Americans. So about 12% for African Americans, 11 or 12% for African Americans, and Hispanics make up about 17-18%. So you'd almost have to be 24 to 30% higher with Hispanics than you would with, say, black voters, or in this case, Biden would have to be doing about 20 to 30% worse with Hispanics than with black voters. That means Trump could be coming close, especially if, let's say, this number is accurate and he's getting about 8 or 9% of the African American vote. Well, in order to get that to 23, he'd have to be doing about that much better than 23% with Hispanics. And probably more, just to get that to 23% of the non-white vote. which makes the top line result even more weird. But then if you look at the white voters, it's extremely evenly broken down. So maybe that's hurting Trump because that is a much larger part of the electorate. So that could actually be a very important distinction to look at, right? But here's the one that truly astonished me. Because most of America considers themselves religious, and specifically Christian, to some extent. And here's the thing, the only group amongst the religious, which I'm just going to go with here, that Biden leads, and admittedly he leads by a massive amount, are those who don't identify with a religion, who are only slightly more common than Catholics in this nation. Yet Catholics say they're going to vote for Trump by basically half of them are saying we're voting for Trump, and Trump leads by about 9% among Catholics. Among Protestants, Trump leads by, well, landslide margins. That's, I think, 16% he leads by. Yeah. So that also makes it really weird to me that the top line result for this poll gives Biden an 8% lead. But then you look at, where a person lives, city, suburbs, town, rural, and also look at the weight. This is the weighting, right? And they're weighting the entire thing by 100% across the board, it looks like. Yeah, okay. Because they managed to call the right amount of people, but in terms of city, if Biden's only getting 50, but this is self-described where a person lives. So this could be very off. For example, I consider myself living in more of a rural area, even though technically I'm in an independent city, but I take 3 steps away from the city lines and it looks like I'm, 40 miles away from the nearest road on the Blue Ridge Parkway. So I'm kind of in between. I'd say maybe a town would be a good indicator. And they did weight these. Okay. But they did get urbanization roughly correct, with most people living in either a city or a suburb. But yeah, so Biden wins pretty heavily in both of those, but Trump wins pretty heavily when you look at rural areas and towns. And in New England, Biden wins. That wouldn't be, or the Northeast, sorry, it's not New England. So, Northeast, Biden wins. That's what I would have expected. Midwest, Biden wins, mostly due to Illinois, especially if it's only 48%, most of that's going to be due to Cook County in Illinois. Look at the South, Trump wins that. Look at the West, well, that's got California and Washington, which are both very heavily Democratic states, so that doesn't shock me at all. But yeah, that whole breakdown gave me some interesting questions. And now if we go to the Monmouth Poll, we can look at this and also do some interesting, get some interesting data. So Trump does better amongst Republicans than Biden does with Democrats, and they're roughly equal with independents, which, okay. If you look at political ideology, liberals are more likely to back Biden than conservatives are to back Trump, and moderates say they're much more likely to back Biden. There is a pretty big gender gap. It's roughly the same. It's basically within the margin of error. Now we look at the age breakdown. It's weird that, well, they also had a massive... That's a lot of... It's a very large age block. So I'm kind of... I'd like to see it broken down a lot more. Now this is a Pennsylvania specific poll. And again, they didn't break down the non-white vote, which is, in my opinion, a bit dubious, but maybe they didn't get enough of each group to have a sample worth publishing, because then they'd have a very high margin of error for one group or another. And this seems a little bit more stable and a little bit maybe more in line with conventional thinking when it comes to non-white voters. Because that would be about, if we look at Hispanics and black voters, African Americans, let's assume Donald Trump is about 8%, so that's 7%. He'd have to be at about 22-23% with Hispanics in order to make that 15, which is where I think a lot of conventional wisdom would lie. Now, Monmouth is a very reputable pollster, but I still prefer Selzer. I think she is almost constantly on point with their methodology, and she doesn't reuse methodology, which is very important. She makes sure to correct whenever there are mistakes and to look for mistakes that do need to be corrected. So, yeah. When you look at polls, always dig into the crosstabs like that and look for the interesting data, because it's going to lead to some better information. Now, this pollster, I brought this up because this is ridiculous. This pollster is absolutely and completely ridiculous with their poll. So, here's their general election poll. Now, I'm not going to be overly critical of an outlier, because outliers can be correct, believe it or not. But oftentimes it's just not good to be the outlier. And it's okay to be a small outlier, but the larger the outlier you are, the less likely it is you're going to be correct. Now, of course, people are going to start pulling up major examples where gigantic outliers were correct, and you have the right to do that. But let's look at this one. So they have the race at Trump with 39 and Biden at 54. If we look at the overall polling average that I have the aggregate of, which is a rolling average, if we look at the overall average, this pollster right here, Opinion, that's about 3 points less for Trump, which is within the margin of error for most polls. And they give Biden a massive 5 points over, which is just outside of the margin of error. So, which would be for most polls. So their poll is basically an 8% swing towards Biden compared to the average. And this is when they are included. And same thing for the monthly. It's just slightly more detrimental to Trump than it is to Biden for the week, for this week's set of polls. So take this pollster with a grain of salt for right now, because they are at the very edge of what I would consider reasonable for a poll. And I can honestly go to the approval rating, and this is actually being hurt by two pollsters, really just one pollster, that is, well, two pollsters that, if it wasn't for their numbers, Trump would be over 45, because for today, I think this was hovering in the mid-45s, and the current week, this week's set of polls, was in the high 46s. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing for the numbers to go off, change by in a single day, given that as a week goes on, you get it, right? So, so I want to see more consistent polling, and I want to see a lot more polling, but I also want to see, but also when I talk about avoiding outliers, I don't want this to be seen as me endorsing polls that are basically all the same. No, outliers are very good things. Outliers are very good things. Because if you don't have outliers, everybody's poll looks exactly the same or is extremely close to one another. And then if it's wrong, everybody winds up with an egg on their face. And that's called herding. And Nate Silver talks about it a lot, okay? Now, I know a lot of people are going to complain about the polling firms, missing a shy Trump vote or whatever. But no, that would be called a statistical error, okay? Because polling is an inexact science, and this is why you use as many polls as you can to create an aggregate to try and get the best possible sample that you possibly can, right? So anyway, I'm going to leave y'all with that, and I want to talk to y'all a little bit later. So take it easy. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.